Welcome to Prose and Cons, a podcast by writers for writers, brought to you by Precipice Fiction. Precipice Fiction would like to acknowledge the people of the Eora and Durag nations as the original custodians and storytellers of the land this podcast was created on.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Prose and Cons podcast, where sometimes we feel like prose and other times we feel like cons. I am your host for today, Alex Eldridge, but also with me I have Matan Elul.
Hi, my name is Matan. I'm an English teacher, but I also write speculative fiction. I've written for the New Mythic, and yeah.
And Phoenix Raig.
Hello. Yes, I'm Phoenix. I'm an editor, founder of Bent Light Writing. We put authenticity reading forward is sort of our tagline. And just a quick little plug. If anyone is interested in learning more about editing in general or learning more about authenticity or sensitivity reading, I spoke at a conference back in San Diego back in April, and I've since been invited back to speak at their virtual conference that they're doing in September. So if anyone couldn't make it out to California, the ACES Society of Editing does do a virtual conference. They're going to have a ton of speakers go in, and you could tune into all of them, ask questions and stuff. So it'll be pretty cool. It's also heaps cheaper than the in-person one. So yeah, VCon 2024. You can learn a whole heap about editing if editing is something you're interested in. There's a whole slew of topics.
Awesome. Very, very cool.
Mm-hmm.
And James Healy.
Hello, I'm James Healy. I'm a writer of horror, science fiction, and paranoid thrillers. I contributed a story towards the New Mythic.
And as I said, I'm Alex Eldridge. I have put out a book called Golden Hour, a collection of short stories, an anthology, as it were, and also contributed a story to the New Mythic as well. So today, topic that we're going to look
too, by the way. I was the only one that did. I was the only one that didn't say it, so I was like, I'm in there too.
I think it goes without saying. Listeners,
we might have inducted someone
here on this podcast is in the New Mythic.
Yeah. Unless we say otherwise.
It goes without saying, but I wanted to say it anyway.
Fair enough. Yeah, nice. Okay, cool. Today we are going to be talking about that most hated question that writers have, because we have really no good answer for it, which is exactly why I'm going to be interrogating it today. We're talking about inspiration. We're talking about where do you get your ideas? Where do your ideas come from? Where does that all happen? The answer is we don't know, but we're going to talk about that for an hour. But before we do that, let's talk about some of the media that we have been consuming recently. And I will start reverse clockwise from the direction that I'm viewing it. I don't know about you guys. With James Healy, what have you been consuming, my friend?
Damn it! I don't think I have been consuming anything this week. So I was like, if somebody else sent it, I'll have a minute to think of something. But I literally, nope. I've got I don't think I've watched or read anything.
Fair enough.
Just
hey,
life. Yeah.
If you're not reading, you're living, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what they say.
Directly from the source.
So hopefully, yeah.
Drinking from the hose.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, cool. Phoenix, what have you been consuming in general?
Well, James and I just did a podcast episode on this, but I finished listening to The Terror and finished reading Hyperion, both by Dan Simmons.
Awesome.
I just started listening to The Willows, another James Healy recommendation. I'm excited to...
Yeah.
It definitely, it's like, ooh, yeah, this feels like old literature with the amount of description in the beginning, but I'm there for that. I love that stuff.
Yeah.
Apart from that, I've been listening to and watching Fantasy High Freshman Year, which is a Dimension 20 real play.
Oh, cool.
Dungeons and Dragons type deal.
Nice. Very, very cool. Matan Elul, what have you been reading?
I might be breaking the rules. I'm going to do something that hasn't been done before in this segment.
All right.
Am I allowed to say poetry? Huh?
Sure.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, you can.
All right.
I mean,
so,
of course, I feel like that's more. I feel like that's more.
Disclaimer.
I'm not on topic then.
I'm not.
If you want to be fancy,
I'm not this sophisticated connoisseur of poetry, but I do take courses in poetry because I'm doing a bachelor in English literature, and we've been diving deep into World War I poetry.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Damn.
let me tell you, it is an experience. Like you think that you understand. Okay, first of all, I'm going to shout out Wilfred Owen. That's the poet I'm thinking of.
man, Wilfred Owen.
Yeah,
Sorry.
he actually died in World War I in 1918, and he wrote some poetry in the years from the moment he was drafted in 1915, I believe. And the point is that, like, you see these things in the movies, you read about them, but there's something about reading a poem written in the trenches that just hit me in a way
Yeah.
that I haven't yet felt it. And he writes in a very disillusioned way about a lot of these poets have, it's no mystery to them that this war doesn't make sense. They make it very clear that it is a war that is, they're very disillusioned. What I'm trying to say is, guys, I think poetry is something I'm definitely getting into recently. And if you guys wanna, I don't know, feel traumatized in a way you haven't been traumatized yet, maybe get into some more poetry.
Nice.
Wow.
Always down for more trauma.
It's really beautiful stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Wilfred Owen, you said, was he British?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I might have a book of that. Yeah.
Let's give you one poem before we
For
before we
sure.
move on. There's one called Anthem for Doomed Youth.
Oh,
Wow.
bleak.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's okay.
gives you the vibe.
Cool. That sounds very visceral. I can imagine, like, because it's hard to write a novel in a trench, right? But like, I think this will
Don't
actually
live
come in-
long enough.
Well, exactly. But poetry is much more condensed, right? So, I think this will actually play into the topic. But we'll come back to it. I have been reading two things mainly. I've been reading The Prize by Daniel Jurgen. It's a Pulitzer Prize winning tome, basically about the discovery and use of oil throughout the 20th century and the
Wow.
late 19th century, and it's fascinating. It's really, really interesting. So I've been doing that, reading a bit of that. That's my, like, what I call my coffee table book, which is just there, and I just pick it up when I see it because it's right there. And I've also I've been on a real almost biopic track. I don't know if that's necessarily biopic. It's like a biopic of oil. But the other thing I've been reading is Going Infinite, which is the biography of Sam Bankman-Fried, who basically he started this crypto trading a hub. I forget what they call it, called FTX. It was like a really big deal. And basically he was just a massive fraudster and criminal, like a Bernie Madoff sort of figure.
How old is he?
He is now about 30 when it all went
You're
down.
reading his
25.
biography.
Yeah. This all happened not very long ago.
I'm 30.
Yeah.
And
Where's your millions?
Where's
defrauded?
your
If someone decided to write my biography right now, what would it include? What I had for breakfast? I don't know. Okay.
In fairness, it's very much like the first like couple of years. It's just like Sam Bankman-Fried wasn't really built for childhood. It just like skims over like the first 15 years. So like, don't worry too much. So I've been doing that. It's by a guy called Michael Lewis, who is an incredible writer. If you have any interest in financial markets or stuff like that, he's just really great. Did another book called Flash Boys and one called Liar's Poker, which are both really, really good books. And with that, let's get into our topic today. And I feel like you started us off on the good foot there, Matan. Because I was just going to ask, like, where do you get your ideas? Which is a big, big topic. But maybe let's go back to that. And let me ask, is the inspiration for that poetry, is it really apparent? Is it apparent that it's directly from World War I? Like, is it like this is just...
Can I read you the first line?
Please do.
It's World War One.
Okay. Okay, check out the first line, guys, of Anthem for Doomed Youth. What passing bells for these who die as cattle?
Wow, that is pretty bleak.
That's pretty direct.
Yeah.
Second one is only the monstrous anger of the guns.
Yeah, wow.
You tell.
And it's all uphill from there, I'm sure.
Yeah. We should do a podcast about war poetry, but from distant wars.
Yeah. Or even war literature in general would be great.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll put it to you guys. What where do you get your ideas from? And we'll just cycle unless anyone wants to jump in. Matan, where do you find yourself? And when I say where do you get your ideas, I mean, what is the circumstance in which you find ideas coming to you? What are you doing? Where are you
Okay,
physically?
I have a good answer and I have a bad answer.
Give me both of them.
Ethically good and ethically bad.
Okay.
I'll start with the good.
Ethically
the
bad.
ethically good
I steal them.
Spoiler. But yeah, the ethically good answer is life, right? You experience things. Sometimes it doesn't even have to be a monumental experience. I remember coming up with a story while walking on the Sydney Bridge, and just what I'm trying to say is when you find that off time where your brain is not being asked to do something that is too intense, that can often be great time. Going on walks just gives you time to think with yourself, and obviously life experience. If you've had a major romantic breakup, you can pour that into your writing. If you walked in the street at night looking over your shoulder, maybe you can bottle up that feeling and write something scary. I remember I'll get to that later. Remind me, Mauricia and Frankenstein. There's a cool story there. The bad answer ethically is that sometimes just imitating. Read great stories written over time and think to yourself, what do I want to take from this? Don't copy, don't steal, but you look at Lord of the Rings. How many books can kind of trace their roots to Lord of the Rings? And you can just imagine that young boy or girl sitting down and reading the adventures of Frodo, and just 10 years later, writing, I don't know, something similar in that vibe. So I think if we call it theft, we'll all feel pretty crappy about ourselves. But go further enough years, and almost every story has a predecessor that you can kind of, let's use a nice word, you can inherit as a writer.
Yeah, nice.
I like what you just said, Matana, about taking influence from people. I like to think of it as it's something I feel proud of, actually, in a way, because it feels kind of like standing on the shoulders of the writers who came before us, who, we're all kind of hammering out this craft and seeing where we can push it and what we could do with it. And it makes sense that we kind of take influence from those that came before us and stuff to, sort of thing. And I like to think, I mentioned it again in the podcast James and I just did about like your literary lineage, kind of, because you can see it with like H.P. Lovecraft and Edgar Allan Poe. I like H.P. Lovecraft, read a lot of Poe and stuff like that, as well as the guy that wrote The Willows. Like all of these three people even then went on to influence Dan Simmons in some way. There's a whole sort of lineage of influence that is kind of building and growing as we move on. I think it's really cool in that way.
Yeah, it's like adding to the like branches growing off a tree almost. It's like it's coming from the same spot, and then like literature is basically all hyperlinks, just like one thing to the next.
Yeah.
What do you reckon, James?
I often, almost the same. Like I often see it as, I kind of tend to feel like I need three things to come together by themselves for me to want to write a story. And one of those things is like the structure or the way the story is told, or like the building blocks of the story. And that tends to be something that I see in other art forms. Usually, I'll usually come across, I'll read something that was really good, and then I'll go back and like take it apart and say, oh, cool, they built the story this way in order to tell, a crime thriller or something. But I'll be like, I'd have something else, and I'd be like, I wonder if that same structure would work if I took it in this direction. So I kind of feel almost like the structure of the story is like the behind the scenes stuff that you can't see, and then there's I guess there's whatever you've imagined, which is the the science fiction world or the wizard school or the kind of idea, and then within that there's often something that wants to be expressed by the writer, something that they wanted to, something that is speckled throughout the story, which is like kind of what was maybe driving or what was maybe keeping them motivated to tell that story, because that story became a vessel to express that thing. So I tend to find that in order for me to start something, those three things need to slot in together. And there's no way to like automatically or like to intentionally do it. It just tends to happen that I'll come across an idea, something I want to express, and then a structure that seems to work. And all of a sudden I'm like, oh, there's a story. Start trying to write that.
That's a good answer.
Yeah. I was going to say on that point, like I tend to find that you like an idea rarely like an idea will rarely come like fully formed. I mean, sometimes it does, like occasionally, but usually it's this composite of a bunch of different things. And I can't remember where I heard it, but someone was like, a good idea is basically taking two not original concepts and sort of smashing them together and creating some new one. And that might be, you know, in terms of in terms of structure, how you're doing it, like you could do, I don't know, something like a locked room, like a detective thing, but I don't know, like you could make that into a thriller somehow. So it's like you literally have to solve the thing for everyone to survive, like something like that. Or but like different compartments coming together. Can you guys think of an instance in which I don't know, maybe you had to combine different elements to come up with a story, or maybe there was an interesting form of synthesis in how you did it? Doesn't necessarily have to be like, oh, there was this thing and I put them together. But yeah, like going on what James said, what are the things that need to come together for a story to sort of exist for you?
I need to
be excited.
Yeah, that's more or less what I was like. There's a certain level of because I have these like ideas all the time of like, ooh, that's a fun thought. And one thing I feel like I've gotten good at is identifying when it's just a fun thought and it's like I had fun with that thought, time to let it go. Like I don't actually want to I guess especially now that I understand like the work that goes into a story, and it's like, do I want to dedicate 2 months to this? Like if it's a short story, or longer if it's longer. And because there's that time currency with it, or that time investment, it's like now I kind of implicitly have more of a compass with like, ooh, I want to spend my next month sort of digging into that further. Like it's like the feeling of that wasn't just a fun thought, but I feel like I've already kind of had the thought, versus like sometimes I have a thought and I feel like I've just scratched the surface. It's like I want to dive into that further and kind of see what I can find and play in that space a little bit. In terms of combining ideas, one sort of same as Matan, I get a lot of my ideas just in those moments where I'm just kind of open, walking around, open to things, and you know, just random thoughts come in and I explore them and stuff. But kind of a combining of like it was sort of a combination of things that created the idea. Was we have the second anthology coming up, and we've, you know, have kind of talked about sort of loose themes that we kind of want to incorporate into that. So in my mind, I kind of already had in the back of my mind, like, all right, looking for a new story idea. I have some of the loose themes in the back of my mind, and kind of with that kind of constantly playing like that. I was just watching TV one time and I saw something that I thought was really cool, and I just kind of like did a quick little matchup, like let me just check really quick, and I kind of put them together. I'm like, yeah, that tracks. I like that. And I had done that a few times actually, with just like something popped in my head. I was like, let me just quickly overlay that. All right, no, there's nothing there. And then like one time I was like, no, I think there's something there. And then it's just a process of like, I'm going to play in the space a little bit. And usually that's me on my phone with my notes app open, just kind of like getting a few scraps of dialogue together, getting a few little like deepening the idea a little bit further. And sometimes it ends there and I'm like, all right, there's nothing really there. Or sometimes usually I end up getting more excited about it as I play with it. And that's how I'm like, all right, now I actually want to put that on the page. I want to bring that to the actual blank page and play with it there and see what a few scenes look like and stuff. And so it's like a progressive expanding out to see if it's actually something I want to develop into a full story.
I really wanted to touch on what Alex said, and Phoenix and James kind of touched on it too, which is like maybe pick something that you like and see what you have to say about it, almost like a dialogue with the material. If you have we see it in the movie genre all the time, and the movie genres kind of go through a cycle in which the genre kind of rises to prominence, and then someone comes and subverts it in some way. And that can be a fun way to be inspired. An example is Terry Pratchett's Guard, right? He takes the classic fantasy world. He says, okay, but let's make the main character the henchmen, the guards. Suddenly you got a story just from that little thing of how can I tell that kind of story different? You can take any classic story archetype and say that story, but. And I think that's a fun way to kind of find what interests you. That story, but point of view of the villain. that story, but Romeo and Juliet actually hate each other. I don't know, something like that.
Mhm.
And I think that's a cool way, especially if you know your genres. Let's say that you know you're a horror guy, consume a lot of horror stuff, and see what your stomach tells you. Like, what's your dialogue? Engage with the material and see what you'd like to do different.
I would say that's also a good way to, it's a good idea finding tool to look for subversions, but I do think you have to be a very firm critic with yourself of like, all right, did you find something you actually want to write about, something like you've used this to find something that inspires you, or are you just trying to be clever?
Yeah.
There are a lot of times where I find an idea where I'm like, I mean, that's just me trying to be clever and cool and subvert something for the sake of subverting something, but I don't actually feel my heart in that story at all. That's just me trying to be like,
Absolutely.
I took your story and I did this with it. And so, but it can be an excellent tool. So it's just like, know yourself is the real thing, but it's a great jumping off point for sure.
And as a pantser, that can be real poison too. It's like just, you know, getting in a car to go on a really long like road trip and not filling up the tank at all, and you get out of the driver and you're like, oh, I don't have the gas for this. I can't make it that far. If you pick something, it's just like, oh, this is a clever little thing. So I think that's a really good point. Yeah, the Phoenix, about knowing the material and knowing your resonance with the material.
Something else, which is a very good tool, and just jumping off your analogy of like gas in the tank, Alex, is to find something, I think, in life that like really deeply angers you, and to find a way of writing about that. Because I find that if you take that approach, anger is like the fuel that just keeps on giving. Like you're never going to run out of stuff to say about something, I think, if it's based on a place of something that angers you. But also, like, if you want to just spark a 3,000 word writing session, just sit down and write about a thing that angers you and just let it all flow.
That's great.
And just keep going. So if you can find a good vessel or a good story that facilitates rants, almost your own rants, you can get a lot of words on the page, and then just be sensible about editing it up to tidy it up and make sure people don't know what you really think.
Yeah, I find that with essays and things, if I'm writing about something, like it's definitely, if something really ticks me off, really grinds my gears, it's good fuel to do a little essay structure with, I reckon. But really, any strong emotion, I think, if you're really sad about something, like that can be as powerful a tool. I think anger has a little bit more natural oomph to it, though. Like if you're really sad, you might be depressed, you know, and just like, I don't want to write about this. But no, I think there's something in that for sure.
Yeah, it's a constructive if you know how to point it in the right direction.
Sure. Journaling is a great idea for finding a story idea, or a great tool for finding a story idea. If you just kind of get into that, just start letting your thoughts flow, just blank page, don't stop writing and just keep writing. And maybe you find nothing, but it's just, the whole idea is just getting into a space where your mind's open and you're just kind of getting the thoughts flowing, and maybe some lines connect in a cool way and you find yourself wanting to write and elaborate on something more. So just little exercises like that to kind of get your mind moving and start seeing what you have rattling around in there, to see if any of the information you currently have sitting in your head connects with some of the other information you have sitting in your head. So any like little eliciting tools like that are great, I find.
Moving on to maybe lack of inspiration stuff. Has anyone here experienced any minor or major form of writer's block? How did that occur? And then how did you deal with it, if you did deal with it, or did you just kind of let it go and just kind of write it out until you were just like, oh yeah, I feel like writing again?
I might be a bit controversial and say, at least for myself, I don't let myself believe in writer's block. And maybe writer's block is a kind of an umbrella term for maybe a bunch of different things. But whenever I feel like, if I'm like, great, I've got time to write and I want to write, and I sit down and I'm like, I don't have an idea to write, I just make myself write something. And I do know what it feels like to just feel like you've got no interest in something, or you can't come up with something. But I feel like, I suppose I take the same discipline from, like, if I don't feel like going to the gym or I don't feel like training or something, I just make myself write something. And even if it's just a journal about my day, I'll just write that. And there'll be often something in there where I'm like, oh, I'll go off in a little meander about that, and maybe not write honestly about my day. I'll start getting creative and say, oh, this is a little bit of a character, and maybe this is how he interpreted the events of my day and stuff like that. So just finding, even just having pen moving across paper, I find gets things flowing again. And even if I just write crap for that day, at least I've written something. And
yeah, I do feel like writer's block is sort of a catch-all term that we attach to a lot of different things that could be a thing, as well as we've romanticized it a little bit. It's like it's kind of like the cigarettes of writing. It's like cool to have writer's block. Like it's like, oh, I'm such a writer, I have writer's block. I feel like there's a little bit of that going on too. But in reality, a lot of the time, like when I don't want to write, a lot of the time for me, it's because sometimes I actually have trouble finding the time. Sometimes the story I'm writing, I know with my longer work, I've had to, at various points, put that on the back burner for a couple months at a time to then be able to come back and kind of reinvigorate the project. But like, there are times when you just need to put a project on the side and just let it be on the side for a while. Like, don't think about it for a while. Or there are times when I need to loosen up and stop. And like, I know for me, it can help to engage in other creative activity that isn't writing, because sometimes writing is like, well, it's my job and I have kind of more weight placed on it. So it's like, this is me being creative, and sometimes it just helps to like do something you don't have as much attached to, like draw something and don't care what it looks like, or cook something, or whatever it is, to just kind of like be creative and just have fun with it. And you just kind of need to loosen up a little bit, or pick up that story. Maybe you are just too strict on yourself with the current story. Like, your expectations for the story you're writing are too high. So you need to just write the next scene, and maybe you delete the scene when you're done. But like, at least just start writing in the story again. Don't make yourself need to be perfect when it comes out that first time. So all this is to say, for me, I would say sometimes the biggest source of my writer's block is a slight state of overwhelm, where I have a lot of projects going, and because I have so many projects going, sometimes none of them move. That's sort of one of the states that's one of my sources, but it could be a bunch of things.
Yeah, I think again, I agree with what you guys said. The writer block is maybe too loose of a term. It could be a lot of things. Exhaustion, fatigue, not having the time. But yeah, what really works for me, honestly, is just reading. It might be rereading a book that I know I love. It might be reading a new book, because I'd like to think that for many writers, the desire to write is an extension of the desire to read, the joy of reading. At least for me, I don't know about everyone. I think for a lot of people it is that way. That you love reading so much that it made you want to write. So I have a few books that are like my go-to books for like picking me up when I feel creatively bankrupt. Like, I gotta say, The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss is great. Is great. Just remind me what I love. Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, Harry Potter. I think I've read Harry Potter. Like, he graduated like 100 times by now. So that works for me.
Nice. Yeah, I think it's easy to fall into a funk. I really, really like your approach to it, James, particularly in terms of like when I get like, if I get really like, oh, I don't know what to do, I don't feel like doing anything, sometimes it's good just to be like, do you have the ability to write? Can you write a sentence on a page? Then you can write, and sometimes really just break it down to those real essentials and go like, come on, can you really not write anything, even if it's crap? But I think really what that question usually comes down to is like, have you lost faith in your ability to say something meaningful? I think is what it comes down to. Like,
wow.
If you kind of write some stuff and you're like, oh, this isn't very good, I don't know what's going on there. And especially, I think a really big thing is getting into a habit of not finishing projects. I think that's a real kick to your like writing confidence. It's really important just to finish stuff, even if maybe especially if it's bad, like just to get to the end of it, because that, like, if you've ever gone through and written a book, and a couple of us here have, and gotten to the end of writing 60,000 words, 80,000 words, by the time you've done that, you might not really care for that story anymore, but you have done it. And there is a story there that is that long. That is a book that you have written. The quality of it doesn't really matter as much. And you can always go back and sort of improve on it. And I think that is the main thing. Like, once something is done, it's there. It can be improved upon. You can take things out. Like one of my favorite stories I ever wrote was called Hopi Springs, and it's just a little 2,000 word thing. But I wrote the first half of it, and I was like, this is rubbish. This story sucks. So what I did was I sat down and thought, like, what is working about this? And there's one interaction in it where basically there's a confrontation, and I was like, well, this is the most important thing about this story. What about that can I bring into the themes of it? And that turning point allowed me to, it pointed the rest of the story in the right direction. So it got to a point where I was like, oh, this is inevitably what happens. And I was really, really happy with how that turned out. So yeah, just always remember, if something's bad, and it might be, you can improve it. Like without a doubt, you can change it to the point where it gets, where it gets better.
Mm-hmm. I love that about finishing projects, and just finish it. And then I have a lot of stories that like I know they're not my best work, especially because they're my earliest pieces. And it's like, but I still love that they're there and they're finished. And it's like, that's where I came from. It's just nice they feel like the foundation of my little house. I pictured a house just then as I was talking, so I just leaned into saying that. It doesn't really my little writer house that I'm building.
Oh, that's beautiful. I just wanted to share what I touched on earlier about how outside influences can affect our writing. So in 1815, a supervolcano erupts in Indonesia, creating this massive storm of dust and dirt that goes up in the air. And effectively what happens is that there's no summer in many parts of the world the following year. So much so that in Europe, basically, they call it the year without summer. They have continuous winter. It contributed to the famine in Ireland, for example, because crops just fail. So basically, for a few years, the entirety of Europe and maybe other parts of the world are just clinically depressed. It's really bad. And what happens is during that time, a young woman, 18 years old, Marie Shelley, spends time on the continent. And she's sitting there with her husband, Percy Shelley, and Lord Byron, some other poets, writers, and they're all depressed out of their... Anyway, they're really in a bad mood, and they're thinking, let's do a competition of like ghost stories. And none of them is a ghost story writer, okay? None of them is a depressed writer until that time. They're all romantic writers, writing about the beauty of nature. Long story short, she writes Frankenstein, or the modern day Prometheus, that's the official name. And beyond that singular piece, which we talk about to this day, you can just look at that year or two following the eruption of Mount Tambora and just say, wow, it really affected fiction and literature and politics across the entire world. So we're kind of on the tail end of something not all that different, in which a global event that could maybe affect literature, maybe we're not aware of it yet, but the post-COVID world, we'll see how that affects writing. People have been stuck with themselves and maybe their partners in small apartments. Let's see what that produces.
Totally.
Very true.
Yeah, inspiration can come from anywhere, I guess. I would like to put to you guys a final question. Can you remember, it doesn't necessarily have to be the first, but can you remember one of the first times that you really got inspired to write a story? What was that story? And what did that feel like for, just for anyone who's listening, who might be considering doing writing, but is like, oh, I don't know, I'm not sure if I have the panache to do that, or like I'm not a creative. Like, what was that like? Was it like just a bolt from the blue? Or was there something that, I'm asking this because I can think of a very specific example that I probably told you guys many times. Or was there something you read maybe that affected it? Or did you maybe have a life event that was like, oh, okay, I need to kind of tell people about this now? Can you guys think of an example of one of the first times, or like ideally what inspired you to become a writer? But if you can't think of that exactly, just sometime where a story really like, oh, wow, I remember that moment. I'll go first so you guys can have an opportunity to kind of think of it. So I've always written since I was quite young. I did stories and, just whatever, and we just print them out and just show my dad, and he'd read it and go, oh, okay, space aliens on motorbikes, cool. And then I don't know. I stopped doing that for a while. I actually went back, and me and my friend, we would write stories at the tail end of high school, I think, or maybe like around 16. But then I stopped doing it for a long time. I was writing just music articles and stuff for a long time. But then I remember at the guitar school that I was working for at the time, I found a volume of short stories, horror short stories by Stephen King. It was called Skeleton Crew, and I still have this book today. And I read it, and I was just like, this is really amazing. Like, these stories are so engaging, and I still think they're great stories. But I was like, this is really cool. I'd like to do this. And then I remember, like, I went to a friend's house, and he was staying with a girlfriend at the time, I think, and it was like not their usual apartment, and it was right in the middle of the city. And I remember coming down there, it was really late, and there was no one there. And then I went through the central tunnel, and I was just like, this is a thing. Like, what if you had to get from one side of this tunnel to the other, and there was a bunch of zombies there? And that, as you guys can guess, is where where the first. But that was this very salient moment of like
for years.
Yeah. I wrote it ages ago. I wrote it when I was about 27, I think. That was like the first thing I wrote. I'd written stories before, but that was like the first proper thing I wrote.
That's great.
Yeah. So that was just this. Yeah, that was this moment of like, and sometimes it happens like that. A lot of the time it doesn't, but sometimes it does. Can you guys think of anything that inspired a story like that?
I didn't have like a bolt of lightning experience like that, but for years I kind of had in the back of my mind like a character, a landscape, kind of I suppose a couple of things like attitudes that this character had and situations that he was looking to avoid and things like that. So for whatever reason, I just had that there in the back of my head for ages. And then every now and again, I guess as I was going through, I would have a life experience, and then something would pop into my head, and it would be this character. I have this character would respond to this event. So I had that in my head for a couple of years, and I'd started to kind of put together a science fiction story around that. And I read a little bit of psychology over the years. I don't know how deep to get into this, but I read that people often there's certain subconscious things that people think about, or certain subconscious things that come out of your subconscious if you've had certain life experiences. So I kind of put together years and years later, after I'd already created a big story and world around this, that all of that came from kind of the subconscious, that there's certain images and certain situations, certain things kind of creep up out of your subconscious in response to certain life events. So once I was able to kind of identify that, I was able to kind of take that story apart and say, like, this is what this is actually about, and kind of reimagine it. But I've always found it interesting, I guess, how the subconscious kind of informs the imagination and stuff like that. There's a story by Emily Scott Mandel called Station 11. And one of the characters in that is working on a graphic novel because she's had in the back of her mind this science fiction scene of sort of rusted boats in the ocean. And her whole life, she's kind of obsessed with this graphic novel that she's trying to create and trying to do. And towards the end of the story, she ends up in a certain situation where she's looking out at the ocean as the sun is setting, and it's full of these like rusted boats. And she's like, "Oh, this is the vision that I had." So it's kind of come full circle. For whatever reason, in her past, she saw the situation from her future. And I always felt the same. I always felt it like a real, like, I was like, wow, I know what that feels like. It's like when you get this full circle and you're like, oh, this thing that I thought I'd made up is actually something else. So that not quite the same thing, like a bolt of lightning like you had, but sort of just something that was kind of creeping through the back of my head for many years.
Yeah.
That was my first story.
That's cool.
When I was in elementary school, I read the Chronicles of Narnia. I read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And something that really resonated with me was that the kids enter the wardrobe and arrive at a different world. And I really took that as like, ooh, you could turn out anywhere. And I remember just trying to imagine in my head, like 100 different wardrobes and 100 different worlds they could take you to. And I started to go into that rabbit hole of what if the wardrobe had taken them somewhere else? Because I'm like, okay, if a wardrobe can take you to Narnia, then what's the limit? And I sat down and started to write a story about a kid entering a different world. And I think I was, 8, 9? So I probably plagiarized a lot of Narnia in that attempt. Instead of talking animals, it was talking dinosaurs. And I thought, I'm so cool. Creative. I didn't copy. Mine's a T-Rex. I think I got about 3 or 4 chapters into it before, the intensity of 4th grade kind of took over. But yeah, that's the first experience I can think of where I was like actively inspired by something.
That's a lot for a 4th grader, like 4 chapters. Like that's
Oh, if you read it, you won't be as impressed. But yeah.
The most like distinct moment the most distinct moment of inspiration I had was I was back when I was working I used to work for Suncorp Bank. And back when I was working from them on my work from home days, I would always get up an hour early and go to a cafe to read and enjoy coffee for a little bit before returning to my house and working from there. It like shook up the day a little bit and it felt like a little bit of a commute, and it was nice. So I think I was reading American Gods at the time by Neil Gaiman, and I was loving that. But there's just this one little bit in there that had this very like sort of old, like an old what is it called? Like a cautionary tale sort of vibe to it, but like old sort of almost like Chinese proverb sort of feel to it. And suddenly I just had this like it was like a bolt of lightning moment. I was like, oh, I really want to write like something that emulates this. Like I really want to write some sort of nobody does. I was like, nobody does this anymore. I really want to write like an old sort of like quote unquote Chinese proverb type flavor of story.
Nice.
So I went home and I logged on to work, but I didn't work. And instead I opened up a note and I wrote out this story all in one go, more or less the first draft. And that story became the first story that I really started to like believe in and was like, I really want to see what I can do with this story. And at the end of the day, I didn't publish it or do anything like sort of like that with that story. I still see it and it sits on I don't know, it's still there, it's developed and stuff. But that's the story that then led me into seeing what I could do with writing. And that's where I started exploring writing as like a part of myself more so. And that's The Tiger and the Fawn. That's the first story that I really like wanted to see what I could do with.
How does it end for the fawn, Phoenix?
It ends really nicely for the fawn.
Okay,
it's a little gotcha story. It's a clever little.
I hope so. I hope you wouldn't just yeah.
It ends very nicely for both the tiger and the fawn. I'll say it like that.
Oh, now I want to read it.
Yeah, me too, actually. I'm pretty happy to wrap it here. I think we've really juiced this one a little bit. Got all the inspiration from it we can. So I actually have a quote that I'll read. This is a really short, simple one. It's by William Faulker, and he says, "If a story is in you, it has to come out." And I think that is a really good, simple iteration on what it means to write. If a story is in you, it's got to come out. Can't stay in there. What are they? There's that cliche. Everyone's got a book in them, right? I honestly do think everyone has a story they could tell. Whether they write it or had someone help them.
That can be a horror story. I'm just saying.
Yes, it could. You could take it very literally. And
stories got to get out one way or another.
Yeah, that definitely sounds like a Stephen King story. It really does.
Give me that story, Alex. Give me that amazing story inside you.
Oh yeah, I was thinking like more like a monster that like aliens
stuff, right?
Yeah. Or like someone who like tries to take a story. Like he's got.
I got a literal book in me. It it hurts.
Get it out! The pages are pointy.
It's a hardcover. Okay. Oh my god!
It's gilded. Oh, cool. Any final thoughts, guys?
Oh, if you want, you can read. What is it called? The power of magic. Maybe I'll put it in the description. But the person that wrote
Big Magic.
Yes,
Big Magic.
Big Magic. Yeah.
Oh, what
Big
a
Magic.
flex! What a
There it
flex!
is.
James just reached behind him and pulled the book from the shelf.
That's
That's the real Big Magic.
That's Big Magic. Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert. She wrote the Eat, Pray, Love.
Yeah.
Big Magic is a great book if you're just wanting a casual read that just kind of, if you're a writer that especially is having trouble picking up the the keyboard or whatever it is. It's an excellent read for just kind of making it okay and kind of helping you get into the I don't know, kind of it brings a lot of mystery into inspiration, which I really appreciate. The way she talks about inspiration, where stories come from. She does elicit a sense of magic that I do believe in myself. So it's really cool for that. Recommend that. Easy read. Yeah, that's a good one.
On that same tip, I will probably recommend The Creative Habit by Twyla Tharp. That one's really good as well. She's I believe she's a choreographer who's worked just for like 50 years or something, and just has a really interesting, fresh take on things. Yeah, it's not a huge book, so you could probably get through it reasonably quickly. But yeah, The Creative Habit by Twyla Tharp, and what was it? Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert, was it? Did I read that correctly?
Yeah.
All right, guys, I think we'll leave it there. If you're feeling like you're in a creative slump, take heart, because there's always something you can do. Just start reading. Don't be too hard on yourself. Basically, just start. The answer is always just write something, even if it's just a page, even if it's just a paragraph. Honestly, like even a sentence. If you would just write one sentence,
I mean,
some really good stories can come from a
Don't take it
sentence.
too easy on them, Alex.
No.
Don't take it too easy on
If
them.
you write one sentence and it's an interesting sentence, then you put it down and you come back the next
It's gotta
day
be a really
and go,
good sentence,
"What does that
okay,
mean?"
listeners? It's gotta be like a killer sentence.
Set a timer for 10 minutes, and whatever comes out. But at least you can say you wrote that day. And it's if you're beating yourself up about like, I can't believe I didn't write another day or whatever, put 10 minutes, put 5 minutes on a timer. What comes out comes out. When that timer's done, you're done. Like,
write 500 words. Whatever's easiest for you. 10 minutes. Yeah, exactly. All right, guys. I'm gonna end it there, and we'll see you guys next time. Take it easy.
See you later. Goodbye.
You're listening to Pros and Cons, the Precipice Fiction podcast.